Hello, and welcome to today's Training Industry webinar, Learner Preferences, How Do Employees Want to Learn? Part 3 of the Modern Learning System series sponsored by Cornerstone OnDemand. I'm Amanda Longo, Creative Marketing Director here at Training Industry, and I'm very happy that you could join us for today's event. Before we get started, I do have some tips and tricks to share with you to help you interact with our speaker. Throughout today's event, please feel free to chat comments in the chat window and submit questions in the Q&A window. We will address comments and questions throughout and at the end of the program during our Q&A section. We also encourage you to share the information you received today with your colleagues and network via social media. Please follow @Cornerstone Inc. and #TIWebinars so we're able to track your contribution to the conversation. You'll notice already a short evaluation survey has popped up in a new tab of your browser. We would greatly welcome your feedback at the close of today's program. Maybe you have something to let us know about our content, the speaker, or topics you might want to see here in the future. As always, today's event will be recorded and archived on trainingindustry.com, and you will receive a follow-up email from us for you to share that link with your team. If this is your first event with us, a very special welcome goes out to you. At Training Industry, we offer dozens of webinars each year on subjects ranging from content development and engagement to influence, social learning, incentivizing training. I mean, we cover just about every topic relevant to leaders of training organizations around the globe. If you've attended one of our programs in the past, like I know some of you have, thanks so much for joining us once again. Our objective in offering sponsored webinar events is to allow our membership the opportunity to learn from the most innovative thought leaders in our industry. Today's event is the third installment of the Modern Learning System series that explores how the modern learning organization can align its infrastructure to support the business in the context of pressures to improve performance and control costs. I know that today's program is one that you'll find to be most useful as we will provide evidence-based recommendations on learner modality decisions. Now, to get us started, I'd like to introduce you to today's dynamic speaker. Dr. Amy Duvernay is the Director of Certification Programs here at Training Industry, where she oversees all process related to continuing education programs, including development and evaluation. Previously, she worked as a business consultant designing and evaluating educational interventions in a variety of industries. Amy has a lot of great information to share with you, so without any further ado, Amy, the microphone is yours.
Thanks, Amanda. So hello, everyone, and thank you so much for tuning in today to hear about our recent research on learner preferences. I'm really excited to be sharing the results of this research with you. It's an ongoing research stream here at Training Industry that focuses not only on how learners want to learn, as the name implies, but also on the delivery and training modalities that they believe are most effective for their training, and the match between those modalities and what we're actually using to deliver training. So I don't want to give you too much of a spoiler, but as a preview, the results point to some discrepancies between those two. It turns out that we're not always using the modalities that learners believe to be most effective. So today we'll talk through the areas where we are really hitting on those preferences, and also the areas where we can do a little bit of a better job of incorporating learner preferences and their feedback about what works. So before I get into the meat of the research, I want to share a story with you that I think demonstrates how firmly learners tend to hold onto their preferences for how to learn. I am the proud mother of a 1.5-year-old named Logan, and she's pretty petite, so she just recently hit the height where we needed to upgrade her to a convertible car seat. So my husband and I did some research, and we ordered a new car seat that we thought would be a good one, and he actually installed it in our car. So easy peasy, done, move on to the next thing. But the next morning, when I loaded her into the car, as I was trying to loosen the seatbelt to give her some breathing room, it pulled straight through the car seat. That was incredibly disconcerting because that seatbelt was supposed to stand between her and imminent danger if we were to get in a car accident. So I quickly hopped on YouTube to see how to get the seatbelt reattached, and in doing so, I found out that my husband had installed the seatbelt wrong. Needless to say, I was a little irked with him. When he came home from work that night, I confronted him about endangering our daughter, and he actually pulled out the user manual to show me where it actually explicitly said to install the seatbelt as he had done. So now we had a conundrum. The user manual says one thing, and that's typically the Bible in terms of installation, but if it was right, then why did the seatbelt pull through? We ended up Googling that and finding a compromise between our two methods that has proven to be safe and effective ever since. But I want to make 2 points about this story that I think kind of demonstrate some of these learner preference issues. The first is that we each have our go-to methods for learning new information. So my husband sticks to the tried and true method, consulting the manual, whereas I went straight for YouTube. There were some environmental factors that impacted our decisions. So my husband unwrapped the car seat, pulled it out of its original packaging, and there was obviously a nice manual presented right there, easily accessible to him. Whereas when I got to the car seat, I really couldn't tell you where the manual was at that point. I was also kind of late for work when I encountered this issue, and so I needed that information right then, and I was in a hurry. When he was installing the car seat, it was on the weekend, and he had the luxury of additional time. So those factors also, I'm sure, impacted our choice of where to get that information. The second point that I think warrants note here is that the two sources of information provided different answers. And that's really important because we know that consistency across media is going to be key to making sure our learners perform consistently on the job. Yet, it's often going to be difficult to ensure that the same level of detail is provided across sources, and as that information changes, it creates a large burden for updating multiple sources. So in the presentation that I'm about to give you, I'm going to highlight a number of different modality options and provide information about their use in learning. And I'll also talk to you a little bit about the ways that they're perceived by learners. But as I do, I want you to keep in mind that consistency across modalities is critical. If you tuned into this, to the first webinar in this series, you also probably know that one of the key challenges that we hear time and time again from training professionals is that consistency is across different modalities is incredibly difficult. So we know that we have to create a balance between wanting to incorporate multiple modalities into programs to accommodate preferences and the need to ensure that learners are receiving consistent information. So speaking of that first webinar in our series, Ken Taylor, Training Industries President, kicked off that webinar event by walking through each of the parts of the modern learning system, which you'll see here on the screen. This system and the webinar series are derived from a recent training industry research report, which combined the results of 2 years of research studies to provide insights into the ways in which the modern learning system operates and is efficiently and effectively functioning. One of the key takeaways from that work is that as learning systems become more and more complex and the potential to integrate those systems grows, training functions have to adopt a systems perspective, and that systems perspective needs to consider all of the parts in tandem and emphasize the way that they work together to impact learning and business outcomes. So today, I'm going to specifically focus on the learner preferences part of that system, but I want you to keep in mind as I'm talking through preferences that they're only one of the key considerations in optimizing your organization's learning system. You'll need to use those preferences as inputs into learning paths, content onboarding and delivery systems as you're designing programs, and you also need to consider them as you're evaluating your programs and gathering data to better understand the needs of the learner and to understand the impact that your programs and initiatives are having. So focusing specifically on learner preferences today, I'm going to start with a brief look at the modern learner. I'm going to talk to you about who she is, what does her work environment look like, and how does she accomplish work in that environment, and then to what extent is that driving the way that she learns, how to perform her job and consumes new information relevant to her role. Next, I'll talk through some of the options for delivering training and the kinds of information that learners need, and I'll touch on how they differ and the kind of objective pros and cons that each type of modality offers. From there, I'll move into kind of the key portion of this webinar, which is learner preferences. I'll speak to how they match or sometimes don't match with the modalities that we're actually using, and I'll highlight nuances of modality use and preferences as they pertain to specific training topic areas. Lastly, I'll close with some recommendations for how to incorporate these preferences into your delivery modality options. So first, who is the modern learner? And what are the environmental conditions that impact her ability to effectively learn new skills or knowledge relevant to her job? So I'm sure I'm going to echo much of what you've kind of heard or know through your own experiences or popular press, but I want to take a moment to really focus on who that modern learner is and how she's learning. So the first thing that we need to know about the modern learner is that she's distracted. She's receiving 122 emails per day. That's 600 emails in a typical work week. And on top of that, she's checking her smartphone 9 times an hour. She's also getting interrupted every 5 minutes, probably by one of those 122 emails, which she's likely receiving on her smartphone. The point is that the modern learner is consumed by a ton of noise that's competing for her attention, and our challenge is to break through that noise if we're ever going to get her engaged with our content and acquiring new knowledge, skills, and abilities. The modern learner also works in non-traditional ways. So we know that there's a significant portion of the workforce that's working as temporary workers or contractors or freelancers. And that impacts the modern learner's engagement with and ties to his organization. We also know that there's a significant portion of the workforce that's not working from a traditional brick and mortar location, which means that the modern learner might be working from his home or a coffee shop, and he might not be working during your traditional or typical 9 to 5 hours. All of these factors are things that we need to consider when we're designing our training programs to make sure that we're meeting the modern learner where he is. Another factor to account for is the expectation for on-demand access. We know that a large portion of learners are gathering information using their smartphones. We also know that they're using search engines to find that information. The modern learner knows that if he has a question, he can hop on Google, type in his search, and assuming his search terms are right, he'll be able to get the answer at the tip of his fingers fairly easy. It's a behavior that's actually incredibly reinforcing because the more we use search engines, the better we are at selecting search terms and the more able we are to find useful and rewarding information. And these are the expectations and sources that we have to compete with as training professionals. If we want our learners to consume our information and find answers through avenues that are ordained by our organizations, we have to make sure that they, for example, install their car seats following factory recommendations. We have to make sure our content is accessible to the learner and is as accessible as these on-demand sources. So finally, the modern learner relies on her social network. We have over 3 billion social media users worldwide, and that's growing every day. The modern learner is on LinkedIn. She's on Facebook. She's interacting with other similar professionals and peers through these social media sites, and she's using that avenue to learn. And in fact, a significant portion of what she learns comes from social media. So I'm going to give you guys an example. I'm kind of a stats geek. I love stats. And I know that's a strong word, but I actually love statistics. Unfortunately, I don't get a chance to flex that muscle as often as I used to. So when it comes time for me to do some analyses, I tend to have some questions. Are my assumptions met? Given the structure of my data, is this the right analytic technique to answer my question? When I have those questions, I sign into my Gmail account and I G-chat my colleagues from grad school. I can get the answer, or at least opinions on the answer, within 5 minutes. And I know that that answer is from a reliable and informed source. This is just one example of how many tools there are available that enable learners to engage in the type of social learning that we're talking about. So given all of these factors that are going to impact our modern learners' ability to engage with our content, what can we as L&D professionals do to accommodate modern learners? Well, luckily, as most of you know, I'm sure, there are a ton of learning modalities and technologies and techniques that are available to us to meet the modern learner where he or she is. And in the next section, I'm going to talk about learning modalities and the ways in which they differ in their impact on outcomes and how the learner interacts with them. So what do I mean by learning modalities? As most of you know, I'm talking about training delivery methods. This is how we provide content to our learners. So first and foremost, I think we tend to think of classroom training, instructor-led, live, in-person, classroom-based training events when we think about a delivery method. And that's really the #1 paradigm for what we think about when we think about training. But there are so many other modalities and methods out there that we can use to deliver content. And in fact, the options can really create some hard decisions on what to select. So how do we know which is best to use? Well, let's talk about how they differ. Modalities vary based on a number of characteristics. First, they vary based on quantity and the timing of resources that are required for their use. So this includes the resources that are required to develop content, to deliver content, and to maintain that modality once it's implemented. So I'll stick with the instructor-led classroom-based training example. With that example, upfront development is going to be less expensive than, let's say, e-learning. But it'll be more expensive to deliver later on, and it will be more expensive to maintain that knowledge within your instructors. On the flip side, the resources required to develop e-learning may be greater upfront, but maintenance is often less expensive for this modality as time goes on. Another way in which modalities vary is the technologies required. So using the same 2 examples, classroom-based instructor-led training is going to be pretty light on the technology requirements. So you might need a computer, PowerPoint, projector, maybe a clicker for the instructor, or you might even choose to incorporate some more intricate or interactive technologies like polling. But when we compare that with e-learning, the technology requirement is much smaller. So for e-learning, you'll obviously need the software to create the e-learning packages. You'll need a platform to house it. And then the learner will have to have access to the kinds of technologies that will allow him or her to access and participate in that program. So that might be a tablet, a computer, or some other kind of access device. But it also means that those devices need to have compatible operating systems and compatible browsers to allow them to not only access the content, but to provide for optimum consumption. So the point is that technology requirements are going to vary greatly across modalities. Modalities can also vary based on how formal or how structured they are. So thinking of that instructor-led training, this modality is going to be more formal and more structured than, say, e-learning. The learner is required to be in a specific location at a specific time and has to consume the information in the order that it's presented in real time. So the lesson structure and sequence is predetermined, and that means that their learning path through that information is also going to be predetermined. E-learning, on the other hand, is a little less formal and structured. The learner may be able to click around to skip lessons or make some choices about what content is most relevant and useful to interact with. Okay, so next up, learner access varies across modalities as well. So this really gets at that need to provide on-demand access to content. E-learning is going to be more accessible to a learner than, say, classroom-based learning. It allows learners to access content at his or her preferred times and locations. Classroom-based learning obviously necessitates that the learner be in the classroom at a specific time and location in order to gain access. Consumption patterns also vary. So what are the frequencies and patterns with which learners consume content? Is content delivered through micro-learning at the time of the learner's need in kind of short bursts of information? Or maybe that content is delivered through a 1-hour webinar presented through Training Industry. In the case of instructor-led training, content could be provided in one setting, or it could be provided over multiple sessions. But that tends to be decided by the course developer. In contrast, with e-learning, consumption typically is learner-directed or learner-paced. The learner will decide when and at what intervals he or she engages with that training content. So, for example, in our Certified Professional in Training Management program, we often see individuals setting a steady pace to work through the 10 online modules that are part of the program. And they tend to spend anywhere from 1 to 5 hours a week on that activity. So on the other hand, we see some folks who sign up and go through the modules in a much more condensed time period. And in fact, some of them have gone through all of that work in as short as a weekend. So point being that it really just depends on what the learner's preference is, and e-learning is going to allow for that greater flexibility of choice where that's concerned. Okay, finally, all of these factors feed into learner preferences. So in the next section, I'll be presenting some research that we've conducted here at Training Industry on how learners prefer each of these modalities. And the research is very clear. Learners definitely have different preferences in terms of how they consume content. But first, what are we using? So our research points to some mainstream modalities. We've done several studies here recently on the use of modalities, and this slide points to the 8 most commonly identified modalities for use. This pattern's been pretty consistent across studies. So whether we're asking learners how they've received training or we're asking training professionals how they tend to provide training, these are the top 8 modalities. First up, instructor-led training is by far the most commonly used modality. And that's not surprising. As I said earlier, this is the paradigm that we're all used to. We tend to think about going into a classroom and learning from an instructor when we think about education. But there are a ton of other modalities that we're seeing get some pretty substantial use. So on-the-job kinds of experiential and informal social learning are also in the top 8, as well as virtual and web-based kinds of learning like videos and virtual instructor-led training and e-learning. One thing to consider when we talk about these most common modalities is that when we want to meet the learner where he or she is, web-based virtual modalities are more likely to accomplish that goal. But we also need to make sure we're breaking through all the noise and getting through to that distracted learner. And in that case, instructor-led classroom-based training is going to be #1 in terms of getting that learner out of her environment, which is filled with emails and smartphones and colleagues, and into a setting that focuses her learning. Okay, so we know that webinars, like the one that we're in today, are one of the top 8 modalities that's being used. But for which training topics are they best suited? So we have a poll here, and I want you guys to weigh in. Are they better for delivering content related to training leadership, sales, customer service, compliance, or technical skills? Where are webinars kind of best suited for providing training content?
All right, everyone, go ahead and make your selection. I've popped open the poll for Amy. Which of the following training topics are webinars best suited for? Our poll has been open for about 30 seconds. Let's give them a little bit more time, Amy. And all right, I'm going to wrap up this poll quick. In 3, 2, 1. All right, let's see what they said. Here we go. Okay, so it looks like the big winner is compliance, with 32% choosing compliance, followed very closely by leadership, 29%, and then sales, customer service, and technical skills tied at 14%. So that's not surprising, given where we're using webinars, which I'm going to talk through in our next slide. Okay, so one question that we've asked here at Training Industry is whether or not some modalities are best suited for certain training topics. One way to look at this is to ask how various training topics are being delivered. And this assumes that training professionals are using the modalities that are best suited for those topics. So based on the results of over 350 learners who provided information about how they were receiving training in these topic areas, we found that the results were actually really quite interesting in that there weren't a ton of differences. So first, as expected, instructor-led training won the day as the top modality used across topic area. Second, on-the-job training came in second for all but compliance training. That shows us that on-the-job training is clearly a convenient and efficient way to deliver training. And while it wasn't second for compliance, it still made the top 5, which leads us to believe that it's probably still a highly viable and useful method for compliance training. Interestingly enough, videos ranked 3rd across all types of training, which again kind of points to the efficiency and convenience of providing training in this way. And then finally, e-learning ranked in the top 5 for all topics.
And virtual instructor-led training ranked in the top 5 for all but one training topic area, showing that for the most part, each of these training topics are being delivered in really very similar ways. So what were the differences? Well, the reason I asked about webinars in the previous poll is that webinars only appeared in the top 5 for one of these topic areas. So those of you who chose leadership, you aligned very well with kind of what's being done in the marketplace. We think that the reason why webinars are being used more frequently for leadership training stems from a couple of things. First, leadership development often focuses on and adopts specific models for what effective leadership looks like. And it may be that webinars lend themselves in a way to providing that kind of information or upskilling or acknowledging learners on what those models are. It's also likely, though, that the kinds of learners engaging in leadership training are leaders that, depending on where they, what their level is within the organization, they may have less time to really dedicate to training. So webinars may allow them to opt into professional development opportunities that they can really engage with at convenient times and from their work location. Finally, one last thing that's worth noting on this slide is that sales and customer service training showed the exact same pattern when it came to the modalities that were most used to deliver them. So a little bit later on, we'll see that that pattern is slightly different when we consider actual learner preferences for the way that they learn these kinds of training. So, okay, so beyond the question of which modalities are used, the next thing that we want to talk through is how many modalities are being used. So the pattern that you see on your screen is something we've seen across a number of training industry studies that ask training professionals how they're delivering training as well as learners how they're receiving it. We've consistently found that training programs are not being delivered using just one modality. So instead, our research indicates that 50% of training programs are delivered using anywhere from 3 to 6 modalities. And that's not surprising when you start to think through how those modalities can be used as part of one particular initiative. So consider new employee onboarding. We've hired a new employee. How are we going to upskill him for the job? We might provide that new employee with an employee manual and ask him to read it before coming to a classroom orientation. We might then ask him to interact with a peer or manager in an on-the-job training session. We could also provide him access to a user-generated content repository where he can ask his own questions, he can view the answers to other questions, or he might be able to post his own content. And each of these different mechanisms is considered a training modality that works together in concert to break through the noise, meet that new employee where he is, and at the time that he needs information. Okay, so we've talked about how the modern learner, who the modern learner is, and the ways that we can reach her with learning modalities. But how does she prefer to learn? And does that even matter? I mean, why should we care? So before I give you the answer on the preferences, I want to talk to you just a little bit about the difference between learning styles and learning preferences. I'm sure that many of you have heard about learning styles. The basic premise, which grew out of Kolb's work in the 1970s, relies on the matching hypothesis. And that hypothesis is that learners have different styles of learning, and that if we can match learner's style with the way that information is taught, we'll see some improved learning outcomes. So an example, learning styles posit that visual learners are going to learn best through imagery. Auditory learners would learn best through listening, and kinesthetic learners would learn best through physical movement, like practice. This concept is certainly intuitively appealing. Unfortunately, a large body of research, including meta-analytic work, has not supported these ideas. Instead, some researchers have pointed to a principle that delivery methods need to really match the training content. So, for example, ILT, instructor-led training, may be best suited for certain kinds of content, but not as effective for others. So let's contrast that with learner preferences. The idea behind learner preferences is that regardless of what's most effective, learners are often customers of training, and it may be that it's in our best interest to accommodate their preferences where possible, because that can result in facilitating engagement with learning content, and especially when they have the power to opt in or out of training sessions. So knowing this, we here at Training Industry wanted to better understand learner preferences, and for specific modalities such as coaching or instructor-led training. These preferences likely reflect more than just their likes or dislikes, but also the realities of the ways in which they're able to learn given their work context and their job roles, and the types of training that they are typically receiving. So let's take another poll. I want you all to take your trainer, training manager, learning professional hat off and consider your own learning experiences. How do you prefer to learn? Maybe you enjoy the traditional formal classroom training setting. Alternatively, you might prefer to learn by watching others. Or you might prefer to get the chance to practice. And some of you may be a little bit more introverted or introspective and prefer to study on your own. And those extroverts out there might prefer to learn more from others. Take a moment and let us know in the poll.
All right, poll 2 for today's event. How do you prefer to learn? Formal lectures, observation, practice, independent study, or informal interactions with others? Go ahead and make your selection. I'm going to quickly move this poll to close, and let's see what everyone said. Let's go. Here we go.
Okay, thanks, Amanda. So this is good. We've got a nice mix of responses here, which kind of tend to reflect what we found. 35% saying practice. That's really interesting, and I'll touch on that in a minute when we get to the answer. And then we've got another 22% on independent study, 20% with that formal or the informal social interactions, and then we also have formal lectures and observations. So clearly a good mix. And some of you might be thinking, well, you know, it really depends. You made me choose between each of these different modalities, but actually I might prefer more than one. We'll talk a little bit about that as well as we get into what actual preferences are. Okay, so similar to your pattern of results, this slide shows the top 5 modalities that learners prefer. Again, we see that by far the most commonly preferred modality is classroom-based instructor-led training, with 55% or more than half of learners indicating they prefer this modality. Not a surprise. Not only is this the most prevalent modality in terms of its use, but it's also the most preferred. Still, that leaves the other half of learners. How do they prefer to learn? So first, on-the-job training is second here in this list, and that makes a ton of sense. So those of you who chose practice or observation, this kind of gets at that. Learning is going to be provided in the environment where a learner can practice his or her skills and could also observe how others are performing the job. Next up, we have videos, e-learning, and virtual classroom training. Again, these modalities tend to provide that easy and convenient access in the location and at the specific times that are most convenient for the learner. So my next point off to the right there is maybe a little bit controversial. I think we like to believe, and popular press would have us or lead us to believe that millennials, which by the way is my generation, millennials maybe have dramatically different preferences than boomers or Gen Xers. But what we've seen in our research is that preferences really don't vary dramatically across generations. In fact, we found a 0 correlation between age and preferences, with a couple of minor exceptions. So we saw a very slight negative relationship between age and preferences for both mobile learning and virtual instructor-led training. And that relationship was such that younger learners tended to prefer those modalities slightly more than older learners. Now, I want to give you kind of a big caveat or I guess warn you against really interpreting that too heavily. The relationship, while statistically significant, was really rather small. So I would definitely not recommend that you go back and tell your training constituents that young learners need to have mobile learning. Instead, the big takeaway from that research is that there really aren't that many differences across generations. And in particular, the rank orders of modality preferences in each of those generational groups were nearly identical. So when we talk about generations, don't necessarily need to consider differences in preferences. My last point on this slide is that learners tend to prefer the modalities to which they've been exposed. And this helps to explain the #1 preference, classroom-based training, because we've all been exposed to this kind of training. We also saw a strong correlation between learners' reported use of each of the other types of modalities and their proclivity or preference for it. This point is really important to emphasize in terms of we need to make sure that learners, when learners express disinterest or a low preference for a specific type of training or modality, that we're considering whether it stems from a lack of exposure or understanding of that modality. And this is particularly important for the more modern or cutting-edge modalities that are just now kind of hitting the training scene. So, for example, virtual or augmented reality. As we begin to incorporate these modalities into our programs, we have to work towards overcoming the initial challenge of helping the learner understand what that modality is and how it can impact training. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at the match between learner preferences and actual modality use. And what you see here on your screen is a simple graph. On the x-axis, you see the percentage of learners who reported receiving training through a specific modality in the past 12 months. And on the y-axis is the percentage of learners who rated that modality as useful for enhancing his or her learning. This is slightly different than the preference look that we were using before, because now instead of asking how they prefer to learn, we ask them to qualify a type of modality in terms of its effectiveness for their learning. And what you're going to see in just a second is each of the most commonly used modalities plotted along these two axes so that you can get a feel for the match between what we're using and what learners believe is effective. Okay, so the first thing that you might notice is that instructor-led training is #1 in terms of how training was received and learners' ratings of effectiveness. Not shocking at all. We've talked about how it's clear that this modality is being used and that it's working. Another point that I want to make here, though, is that there's generally a linear relationship. So you could draw a pretty straight line from the y-axis, probably starting around 52% or 55%, straight to that instructor-led training dot on the graph. And that would really represent a strong, positive, linear relationship between usefulness for enhancing learning and the kinds of modalities that learners are receiving. The point being that we're tending to provide training through the kinds of modalities that learners believe work. We're using less of the modalities that they believe don't work. So I'm not going to draw that line, because I don't think that you all came here to simply hear that you're doing a good job, which as a side note, the data clearly indicate that as a whole, the training industry is using modalities that learners rate as effective. But of course, these data also provide some additional guidance in how we can do an even better job. So instead, I'm going to draw 2 additional lines. And these lines split up the graph into 4 quadrants, each of which points to a different set of recommendations. So in the next 4 slides, I'll review these in depth. Each quadrant is labeled to reflect its general use and learner ratings of effectiveness. So first, let's talk about quadrant 1. We call this the useful and often used quadrant. Here we see that instructor-led training, on-the-job training, videos, and e-learning are each considered fairly effective, and these are the ones that are being used pretty frequently. So the takeaway here is to keep doing these things. The next quadrant is the less useful but often used quadrant. And here we see that virtual instructor-led training and webinars fell into this quadrant. These represent lower cost options, which helps to explain why we're using them fairly often. But because they're virtual, they may not provide as much interactivity or be as engaging as some of the other modalities, which could help to explain why learners don't consider them to be as effective. All right, moving along to the unsure and not often used quadrant. These are the modalities that learners haven't really been exposed to. So they aren't rating these modalities as highly effective, but we can't be really sure if that's because these modalities aren't effective or useful for their learning, or if it's because they haven't been exposed to them. They may just be kind of unsure of how it might impact their learning. So an example, virtual and augmented reality may not be rated as high because they generally aren't receiving this kind of training. And so they don't understand how it could impact their learning. We also have books, which is obviously a tried and true modality. In that case, it's probably that books have limited applications in terms of where they can be used for learning. Okay, moving to quadrant 2, the useful but underused quadrant. This is the quadrant that I really want you guys to focus on and emphasize, because it represents an opportunity for us to start using more of the modalities that learners really indicate to us are most useful for impacting their learning. So let's take a closer look. On-the-job coaching, simulations, and formal coaching each provide opportunities for deliberate practice, and they pair that practice with structured feedback. If you follow the work of Dr. Anders Ericsson, who will be keynoting at our Training Industry Conference and Expo in June, you know that deliberate practice, when paired with structured feedback, is a key component to gaining expertise in a specific skill set or area. Likewise, informal social learning and performance support tools often provide information at the time of learner need, allowing for that convenience and timely access, as well as that social interactivity. Finally, adaptive learning made the list. This type of training creates a personalized learning experience which adjusts and customizes content to accommodate the learner's individual knowledge and skill set. Each of these modalities in this quadrant represents a gap between what the learner believes is useful and what training professionals are actually doing. So I'm going to go into some learner gaps in more detail. On the screen you see two modalities, on-the-job training, which it fell into the often used quadrant, and yet it still represents a pretty significant gap. So this is defined as training that's delivered on the job, as the name implies, and while 82% of learners rated this modality as very useful, only 36% had received on-the-job training in the past year. Similarly, informal social learning was a kind of a bigger gap here. This occurs through social interactions with coworkers, peers, and supervisors. These two modalities then represent an opportunity to provide content that's embedded into a learner's actual work environment through sources that they encounter frequently. And the trick with these two modalities is going to be how to structure them so that content is formalized to include the information that learners need to know, but make sure that they still feel organic and informal and accessible to the learner. So next up, we have the juxtaposition of on-the-job coaching and formal coaching. These also represent a preference gap, the difference between the two being that formal coaching tends to occur kind of off-site and be provided by an external person who's external to the organization. On-the-job coaching tends to occur, like the name implies, on the job, and tends to be provided by a peer or a manager, somebody that the individual or the learner interacts with more frequently. And we can see the gap here as well. So 65% of learners rated formal coaching as useful, but only 11% had received it in the past year. Similarly, 76% of learners rated informal or on-the-job coaching as useful. Only 19% had received it in the past year. So these, again, have that potential to allow for practice on the learner's part with the delivery of specific actionable feedback from the coach. And we know from tons of research, including Bloom's original two sigma problem, that providing that one-on-one coaching can really lead to some incredibly positive outcomes for the learner. one additional insight that I want to just touch on really quickly, we just wrapped up a different research study in honor of International Women's Day, where we focused on differences in the kinds of leadership training that men and women were receiving. We were hoping to identify some places where L&D can really create impact in closing the gender gap. One of the key insights that we found was that formal coaching acted as an equalizer, helping to bridge the gap in the effectiveness of men and women. And when formal coaching was provided, leadership training effectiveness levels were nearly equal across genders. But when it wasn't, there was a pretty large disparity in leadership effectiveness levels. So what's really interesting from that research and relevant to this research is that men were twice as likely to indicate a preference for formal coaching, and women were actually more likely to indicate a preference for on-the-job coaching. So the point that I would make here is that we need to consider how preferences might vary across some of these key demographic and learning groups. All right, so last but not least in this learner preference gap series that I'm reviewing are simulations and job aids. Simulations model real world scenarios, and job aids provide support on the job. Simulations, again, offer that opportunity for deliberate practice with immediate feedback, so it's not surprising that 70% were rating them as useful. However, they often require extensive development, so they can be rather costly to use and maintain, and so that's probably why there's a gap there. Job aids, as I said, can be really helpful and provide convenient access at the time of learner need, but it can be difficult to anticipate all of the needs that the learner will encounter. So again, we see that the majority of learners might be finding them useful, but few have learned through these methods in the past year. And that leads us to our final poll. Let's see how many of you get this one right. So for which of the following topics is e-learning most valued by learners? And if you remember back to the beginning of this presentation, we know that it was most highly ranked in terms of its use for compliance, but is it most valued by learners for that topic? So take a moment and weigh in on which topic area e-learning is going to be best for.
All right, everyone, this is your last option for some interactivity before we have the home stretch here into our Q&A section. Got a couple more moments to answer our third and final poll for today's event. For which of the following training topics are learners most likely to value e-learning? Go ahead and make your selection. I'm going to go ahead and close this poll here and share the results. Okay, so similar to its use, you guys tended to pick compliance, which very interesting. And then next up, we've got technical skills, followed by customer service, leadership, and then sales as our last kind of topic area for e-learning. So let's have a look and see what the learners have to say. Okay, so if you picked compliance, you were right. But interestingly enough, you were also right if you picked sales, which was the big loser from that poll. So we'll talk a little bit about that, but before I do, let's just kind of take this slide in. I want to point out one key difference about this slide when compared to some of the preceding slides. So for this ranking, I looked at the average effectiveness ratings rather than the percentage of learners who rated each modality as very useful. These are two really important metrics that are really highly correlated, but they sometimes produce different results, and that's why we look at both of them so that we understand the nature of learner preferences. So when we look at this cut, it provides some interesting additional insights. First, despite winning the overall preference battle and being the most commonly used modality, when we look at average effectiveness ratings for specific training topics, instructor-led training didn't win in a single category. But it was #2 for most of these topic areas, and it was #3 for sales. So still clearly a highly preferred or highly effective modality. But our clear winner on this slide is obviously on-the-job training, which was #1 across all of these topic areas. Learners clearly believe that this is the most effective modality across all types of training. Second, across all of these types of training, we saw that the same 4 modalities always made the top 5 list. So on-the-job training, instructor-led training,
on-the-job coaching, and informal social learning were always in the top 5. So where did the differences lie? Well, for leadership, learners tended to prefer simulations. And this makes sense because it allows them a low-stakes method of practicing that, assuming it's delivered via some technology, is going to be accessible and likely conveniently fit within leader schedules. Similarly, simulations were preferred for customer service training, probably for the same reasons. For sales, coaching played a more important role, which makes a ton of sense in terms of being able to practice. Sales was also one of 2 topic areas for which e-learning was ranked in the top 5, along with compliance. So here's why this makes sense. For sales, e-learning may be really useful for providing product knowledge outside of the typical business hours in which sales personnel are likely to want to be in front of their customers. So I think it's the convenience factor that's really putting it in that list. Then finally, technical training was the only topic area for which learners' average effectiveness ratings placed job aids in the top 5. This is, again, very intuitive. Job aids tend to provide highly technical information that may be better housed in this format rather than learned through rote memorization. Okay, so let's put it all together and talk through what are the best practices and how can we use this information in our learning programs. So starting with Quadrant 2, the useful but underused modality, I want to challenge you to consider where you can start to use these modalities more. And I also want to really, challenge you as well to start small. So you can't adopt all of these modalities at once. And that really wouldn't be the best way to serve your learners. So instead, try to incorporate elements of these programs into the programs that you're already delivering. And pair them with some of those tried and true modalities, like instructor-led training, that can allow for a multimodal learning experience, and also provide opportunities to practice skills, receive actionable feedback, and reinforce other types of learning. For Quadrant 3, the unsure quadrant, the big takeaway here, I guess recommendation, is don't rush into using the latest and greatest. Our research shows that that's not even what the learner wants. Instead, what's going to be a good kind of best practice here is to use these new options sparingly and also try to wait them out so that the market has time to really mature and we can get a better feel for what the features are, the benefits, and the disadvantages of their use. And where you do use them, make sure that you have a process in place to regularly gauge their effectiveness. Okay, so Quadrant 1, the things that we're using and are useful, you have a big thumbs up here to keep using those modalities as they make sense. Don't break what isn't broken. Okay, finally, Quadrant 4, the less useful but often used modalities. The key here is to consider economic trade-off. So these modalities represent a low-cost option, and so they aren't going to go away, but we want to make sure that their quality is up to par. So make sure you're incorporating best practices for their use. Incorporate things like breakout groups, polls, help to simulate the in-person instructor-led experience, and also make sure that learners are engaging in these types of programs in environments that are conducive to learning. That means that they need to shut down their email applications, they need to remove themselves from their typical work environments, and they really need to get away from those interruptions. Okay, now I'm going to wrap up with some general recommendations, and I will open it up for questions. We know that learners have options in the way that they learn. And if they don't like the format that we're using, they can access information in other ways, such as YouTube or Google. So the first thing I want to urge you to do is strive to empower learner access to content by making it available through multiple modalities. Give them the power of choice in how and when to engage with training. Next, I want to challenge you to work towards formalizing the informal. We know that learners are learning through informal means, and the challenge here is to create formal mechanisms that mimic those informal ones so that we can ensure that the content that they consume is accurate, up-to-date, and reflects organizational values and priorities. Just as important, make sure you're architecting learning paths. That means you can't think about learning programs in isolation, but instead you have to start considering how learning programs work together to progress a learner throughout his or her career. On top of that, L&D has got to adopt marketing principles. So if we're going to break through all of that noise and distractions and the non-sanctioned avenues for learning information, we have to start using marketing to get the learner to use our content points. And this touches on that need, again, to break through the noise. Marketing is a really great way to get that message across and also to help them understand those newer modalities that they may not have had exposure to. The final point here, I want to make sure that you guys are considering topic area and making sure that the modality that you're choosing is a good match for the kinds of content types that you're delivering through your training. Okay, so that is the end of the presentation, and I am really, really excited to hear your questions. So let me open it up. Amanda, are there any burning questions from our attendees?
Plenty. So I'm going to jump right in here. This first one comes from Juanita. She says, I have a limited budget and can't afford to use multiple modalities. What recommendations do you have for me?
That's a great question. I know that when you're operating on a limited budget, maybe you work in a smaller organization, you may not have the kinds of resources available to use that multimodal kinds of learning. I guess my recommendation would be to start with the modality that you think is going to reach the most people. So if you have a distributed workforce, perhaps it's a virtual modality. If you can get everyone together into one room, maybe that's instructor-led training. Then the other, I guess, recommendation that I would have is to see if there are any less expensive, more grassroots way to build in more modalities. So a tip, if you want to incorporate more on-the-job kinds of coaching, is to just put together a tips or strategy sheet that you distribute to managers that talks about the kinds of skills that you'd like for them to reinforce and some tips and tricks on how to do that. It may not result in a consistent learning experience for all learners, but it will provide an additional modality that could help to reinforce some of the training content that you're delivering in other ways.
Excellent. I know we can't go back to the quadrant, but Anthony and a couple of other people had mentioned or wanted to ask a question about what the driver was behind the quadrant axes. They didn't seem like they were equal in size. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, you know, I should have mentioned that I chose those lines. I mean, I interacted with our team here for some advice, but really those lines that we drew on the graph were kind of arbitrary and meant to help to clarify the message. Whether something fell into quadrant 1 or quadrant 2 could depend on where we placed that line. And the idea was that we wanted to kind of get a better feel for where the clumps of data occurred. So it was more of an art than a science.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. And Julie and a couple of others were wondering if we were going to show that slide again, or if we could share that as a handout. I did want to let everybody know that the recording of today's event will be sent to you along with a link of the slide deck for you to share with your team. But Amy, this did come from a research report. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it did. The Modern Learning System Research Report, which we released at the end of last year, and it is the basis for this entire webinar series. Based on research data that we've collected over 2 years. And I believe that attendees are going to receive a free copy of that report. So I guess be on the lookout for that as well.
Excellent. I've got one last question I think I can slip in here. You mentioned the importance of ensuring consistency across modalities, and Suzanne was wondering, given all the moving parts, how can she do that?
Yeah, I mean, that is a really tough question, and one that I don't have an easy answer to. The modern learning system that we are moving to as a training function really does take the systems perspective. And so being able to ensure that consistency is really about adopting that systems perspective. It means that we're tracking, that we're documenting, and that we're just really staying on top and monitoring where changes and consistency need to be made. While I hope that answers your question, I want to go back really quick. Amanda, you asked about the research, and I just wanted to touch on one more thing. We are going to be releasing a report on the learner preferences data, and in addition, we've conducted an additional study that's going to be folded into that report in June. So for those of you who attended who are interested in learning more, that report will be coming out later this year.
Perfect. All right. Just a reminder to everyone that we are going to send out a follow-up email. It will include a link to this on-demand recording, as well as a link to the slide deck and a link to the research report that all of this great information came from. Amy, thank you so much for packing so much into this hour. I know there were tons of questions that we didn't get to, but I'm thinking that Amy and her team will probably be getting back to you. But with all of the things that you were able to share with us in such a short amount of time, I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to do that. So thank you so much, Amy.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. If you'd like to join us for some more upcoming events, check out trainingindustry.com/webinars. Of course, all of our events do pre-qualify you for 1 credit hour by ISPI and towards your CPTM recertification. What is CPTM? It is the Certified Professional and Training Management Program. If you're looking to up your professional and personal game by strategically aligning your learning initiatives to your organizational goals, this is the program for you. You can join us at any of our intercontinental practicums or virtually from anywhere in the world. Find more information on our website. I'd love to meet you in person. I know Amy will be there at TICE this year. Training Industries Conference and Expo happens Raleigh, June 26th through 28th. We'd love to have you join us. Early bird registration is only open to the end of this month, so go ahead and pop on to TICE2018.com and register. Can't wait to meet you there. One last time, thanks so much, Amy, for being here. And of course, thanks to Cornerstone On Demand for sponsoring this webinar series. And thanks to all of you for attending. It's great to have you here. We can't wait to see you back here next time. Until then, enjoy it out there.